Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat and my guest today is Andy Duncan, and together we will endeavour to cut the financial crap. Austerity, bailouts, base rates, deficit, default, derivatives, inflation, deflation, stagflation, negative equity, negative growth, quantitative easing, stimulus. Just what on earth does it all actually mean? Does today's financial and economic news leave you bored, bamboozled, apathetic, or even angry? Can't bear to hear any more bull about bulls and bears? Anonymous think tanks, faceless foundations, and previously unheard of institutes. Where do they all come from? Why do we need them? And more importantly, who pays for them? In an age when we're told that we can't afford enough nurses and teachers, just how can we afford so many economists? And what if the myth and mystery of money is nothing more than the black magic of a modern day Wizard of Oz? What if everything you thought you knew about money was a lie?
Hello and welcome, Andy, and thank you very much for joining us again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
My pleasure to be here.
Now, Andy, today we're going to endeavour to cut the financial crap. That is to say, to bypass a lot of what the mainstream media present with regards to finance and economics, which is generally, in my experience, characterised by inaccuracy, a lot of misrepresentation, and indeed a lot of ignorance as well. And the way this information is put across to the public accounts for widespread ignorance when it comes to economic matters, and also a lot of apathy. I think people sense that a lot of what's been presented to them in regards to their own personal economy and the wider economy nationally and the global economy, they sense that it's important somehow, but it's just not made easy for them to get to grips with it. And indeed, there are a lot of institutions and organisations, banks and government agencies among them, who find this quite desirable, actually, public ignorance. And if that apathy was to continue, that serves their ends rather well.
Well, it's a long, complicated story. You've raised lots of different areas there. I think the main one is the mainstream media is very tied into the government by necessity, because if you work for the mainstream media, first of all, you're licensed by the government, and if you displease them, then you will have your license removed. But also, as well, most of your sources of information are from the government. So if you're a financial correspondent, you'll go to the Bank of England press briefings, you'll go to the Treasury press briefings, and so on. And virtually all of your news is just being handed to you by government press officers. And the government spend an inordinate amount of time and money on press officers and making sure that those releases are really good for newspapers. So the MSM is tied kind of symbiotically to the government. So they have to say what the government believes. And I think most of us, many people in this country as well, because of going to schools where we've had pumped into our minds over many, many years that all is good is government. We kind of want to believe the government is good. We kind of want to believe everything is okay. We want to muddle through. We want to get through. So I think people, if they want real news now, do have to turn to alternative media, because the government's not going to broadcast anything bad about itself, and the mainstream media is frightened or incapable of broadcasting anything bad about the government.
Yes, and we do hear a lot of people saying, people frustrated with the MSM, as you call it, mainstream media presentation of all sorts of events and affairs, not just finance and economics. And they say, we should hold these people to account and we should force them to have higher standards. But I think actually we should just forget about it, just leave them to it, because they are increasingly irrelevant. And it's only when you watch or listen to or read mainstream media that you get them telling you repeatedly how they are still, the guardians and the gatekeepers and how important they are. But actually, that's not a true reflection of the situation out there, really.
Well, I think Gary North summed this up best. They used to be the gatekeepers. There used to be a citadel. A citadel was a country or a society, and they used to guard the gates. The problem is now for them is that the walls are down. The internet has enabled the walls to come down. So they're still guarding these gates of information and filtering information and doing things like they did the other day, where there's stories about gold disappearing. So conveniently, the Queen is then seen walking around the vaults in the Bank of England, completely stage managed. BBC fell for it. everyone falls for it, all this stage management of presenting a good picture. I mean, they never said who owned the gold that the Queen was looking at. I mean, that gold was probably owned by someone else, but the kind of suggestion, the implicit suggestion is that the gold is somehow British. And there wasn't actually that much. There was a few hundred tons in that room that she was in. So if it was the British government's gold, it was all of the British government's gold in that particular room. So the walls are down. I mean, I very rarely watch mainstream media these days, and it's great that newspapers' figures are falling. You know, sales of the kind of mainstream newspapers are collapsing, and hopefully soon then most of them will be out of business. People are watching less and less of, say, the BBC News. The big hoo-ha recently about Newsnight and its various things was a storm in a teacup for the chattering classes of London, because I didn't watch any of that and I don't particularly care. And hopefully a lot of people also don't care, and they use the internet to find the information that they're after.
Yeah, that stunt that you're referring to with the Queen really did take the biscuit. It was a case of, as you say, for those of us who are, taking more of an interest in deep financial and economic stories, and we've been hearing a lot in recent times about various countries and central banks' gold holdings. Are they really there, etc., etc. And there's a lot of information you can unearth if you go digging, but that finally starts to bubble to the top of the mainstream, and then literally it's like, show them a picture of some gold. Now, hang on, we did that before. Show them a picture of some gold with someone they trust
with the Queen.
Yeah, her Madge. We just wheel her out. And, God bless the Queen. There, the gold's there. Nothing to see here. Go about your business.
I thought it was interesting listening. I mean, I did actually watch that piece. It was interesting listening to the implicit messages they were trying to push there. There are another 8 or 9 rooms like this. Are there? Well, why didn't you show them to us then? Why did you just show us one room? So it really is kind of all smoke and mirrors, and no ownership, no audit of the gold. Just here it is. Here it is physically. It belongs to someone, and the Queen's holding it, so it probably belongs to her, and she's the British government. But nothing stated as factual. Quite interesting.
Yeah, from a lawyer's perspective, you could see there how if that was then, it couldn't be used as evidence basically later. We didn't actually say this. It's about inferring things, and then the viewer or listener filling in the blanks in their head, but that's them doing that. That doesn't mean that's the truth as such.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing with the financial debate is we've got an extreme right-wing party, the Conservative Party, wants to spend, I'll just make up some numbers, they want to spend £698.5 billion this year. An extreme left-wing government, the Labour Party, wants to spend £697 billion this year. So the managed differences between the entire spectrum of political thought is £1.5 billion over, from 697 to 698.5. So you've got God and the angels at one end, and you've got the devil and hell at the other end. And the press goes along with this because they like a conflict. It sells their services. They like seeing people fighting in a ring, a red corner and a blue corner. But isn't it pathetic? £1.5 billion is the difference between both the extremes, and yet they're still both sides. One side wants to borrow £150 billion, and the other side wants to borrow £148.5 billion, while still taking in about £500 billion a year in tax. Now, what they should be doing, of course, is completely slashing government in two. They should completely stop all borrowing completely, and they should even start cutting taxes for real. So they should be cutting government spending by 200, 250, 300 billion pounds a year. That's going to be the only way to get out of this kind of financial crisis safely, but they won't do it. What they'll continue to do is borrow, and then they'll buy their own borrowing through the Bank of England, printing money to buy the Treasury's bonds, and then we'll enter a period of rising inflation. Then they'll face a choice, and I suspect that when they're faced with that choice, they'll just keep printing rather than letting the collapse happen.
We'll come to some of those points in more detail shortly, but in terms of shrinking the government down to size, and the fact that really when you look at their policies and crunch some of the numbers, that you really can't put a cigarette paper between them. I would refer listeners to the last interview on legalisefreedom.com. That was with Douglas Carswell MP, and we go into all of that in a lot of detail. But we'll confine ourselves somewhat more to the economic and financial realms. And at the core of all this, the one thing that most people still cannot grasp is basically the fundamental nature of money in our system, where it comes from, the nature of it, and it's basically the central fact that it's created as debt. And a lot of people will hear that and go, oh yes, I heard that somewhere, read that somewhere, but they don't actually fundamentally understand what that means. It means that the money, people think of money, oh well, that's the coins and paper in our pockets, but I think in Britain anyway, that's around about 3%, and probably similar in other comparable economies. 3% of the quote-unquote money is coins and notes, and that's the only money that the government makes. That's the only money there is. All the rest of it comes from private banks and is lent into existence. That means it's not even just created out of thin air and then circulated. It's circulated with and then needs to be paid back with interest. But of course, it doesn't take a great leap of intellect to work out, well, say you create £100 for the sake of just a number, and you then say, okay, well, I put it into circulation and we require £110 back. Like, okay, well, where's the £10 going to come from? Well, maybe you could get it from the same bank, but then that would have interest attached to it as well. So there's this fundamental, how can I put it, misunderstanding or lack of understanding about the nature of money itself.
I think it's the greatest confidence trick of all time, isn't it? It's lasted now about 500 years or so, maybe a bit longer. We start off with private money thousands of years ago being little nuggets of gold and then little nuggets of silver. And then weighed and then stamped as a kind of badge of authenticity. This little nugget of gold weighs, one Athenian owl's worth of gold in here, kind of proved by the stamp of the owl. And people would weigh the money anyway. And eventually we get through to the kind of medieval times where you used to store your gold with the goldsmiths because they had the biggest vaults. And strangely enough, they were all centred and clustered around exactly where the Bank of England is now. And then the goldsmiths noticed that what they could do is, instead of giving gold in and out, what you could do is give paper receipts in and out. And there was, at that time, a one-to-one correspondence. So one piece of paper going out represented one gold coin. And that piece of paper would then float around the markets of wherever it was. Let's imagine it was London. And people wouldn't bother going to get the gold. It was too much hard work. They'd just leave it in the goldsmiths. And the bits of paper would float around the economy, each one representing one gold coin. And then the goldsmiths noticed that no one ever turned up to get the gold, and on a typical year they might only pass out about 5 or 10% of the gold. So they thought, well, why don't we just print some extra receipts? No one's going to notice. It will go into the marketplace. I'll buy some stuff, and when I buy some stuff, that will never come back to me, and I'll be long dead and gone before that ever becomes uncovered. And we eventually end up with a fractional reserve system of 10%, so there's only 10% of the gold representing 100% of the money. Far too many tickets representing far too little gold. But then the governments gave banks protection for this, because who were the goldsmiths lending money to? They were lending money to people like Charles I and Charles II to fight wars with. So these different governments gave these banks, the goldsmiths became banks, they gave these different banks some legal permissions to do this with people's money. So hence we end up with the modern world, and eventually even the gold backing went. So now there's no gold behind anything, it's just paper. So you go to the Bank of England now, present a £10 note, they'll give you 2 £5 notes. You give them a £50 note, they'll give you 5 £10 notes. So it's all completely meaningless. The Treasury will issue a bond, a private bank will buy the bond, that bond will then be used as an asset, and on that asset they can then lend out 10 times that amount of money electronically. That money then floods into the economy, and we have more and more paper money chasing less and less goods.
And if this seems just too simple, really a system to be believable, one of the quotes I like about this is from Henry Ford, the motor guy, yes, he himself, and he said once, "It is well enough that people of the nation," referring to the US, "do not understand our banking and money system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." And that's really what's at stake, is that it seems to be too simple. It can't, in fact, be that simple, but it is. And that almost in itself seems like a block to people understanding it. It's almost like that they're paralyzed by a system that, as you say, now the money's backed by nothing. It's from thin air. We have a huge balloon sort of economy globally now, with the most profitable thing to do is to make money from money. And it's created this huge shadow system that really is built on sand.
Yeah, I think most people don't have to understand it, but what most people do is they get on with their normal day lives. They're carpenters or they're plumbers or they're doing other useful things. They just need to trust that someone understands it. And who do they trust? They trust the monetary intellectuals. The problem with trusting the monetary intellectuals is that they make a huge amount of money themselves personally by being fully in with the system. So if I get a degree in economics, and I'm one of the people who's trusted by society to tell everyone that everything's good, where am I going to go get a job? I'll get a job with either central government or a large bank as a large bank's economist or a government economist. And then I'm going to get a salary, I'll just make up a number, £100,000 a year, plus benefits and pensions and so on. So I'm very fully involved with believing in the system because it's generating me a very nice income. This was one of the things Murray Rothbard used to say. Under a free market system with proper money, we wouldn't need very many economists. The reason we need thousands and thousands of economists now is to kind of maintain this kind of green curtain around the myth of money. So the economists, the intellectuals, have basically been bought off with this system, and they've deluded themselves as well because with government control of education, who does the government back? Do they back a university which does an Austrian school of economics department, or do they back a university which has a Keynesian or a monetarist school of economics? They'll back the Keynesian one, and they'll pump lots of money into that university because Keynesianism basically says government needs to control money. So preaching to the choir there. So this is one of the dangers of letting governments take over education, as they did in this country, in the UK, just before, during and after the First World War, and the universities basically sold themselves to the government for funding. From that point on, governments have funded these kind of Keynesian schools. These Keynesian schools produce people who believe in Keynesianism. They then flood into the economy, get very nice, easy jobs with government and big banks, being paid very well, and then they tell everyone else that everything is fine and dandy, and that this is the way it must be, this is the only way it must be, and we must trust the government.